Would you accept this great honor that I have offered you? With all my heart, no.
Near the beginning of Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius wants General Maximus to become the next Caesar, but Maximus refuses. This is a typical refusal of the call to adventure, a trope that can be found basically everywhere in modern storytelling.
I need your help, Luke. She needs your help.
I can't get involved. I've got work to do.
And well, I shouldn't say modern. When Menelaus called Odysseus to join the Trojan War, Odysseus refused, and even pretended to be mad to avoid going. So refusals of the call to adventure have been around for as long as we've told stories around campfires. And in the 40s, some guy came up with a famous recipe for stories that he called the hero's journey, with the refusal of the call as the second step. In this video, we'll look at many examples of refusals in all sorts of stories, but my goal here isn't to make a catalogue. I want to explore, from a writing perspective, what separates a good refusal from a terrible one. And we'll also take a deep dive into Maximus's refusal, which I consider one of the GOATs, because behind the seemingly classic refusal, the movie actually breaks storytelling rules to create something truly unique. But first, just to illustrate that refusals of the call to adventure really are everywhere, and that I'm not just cherry-picking examples, let's take a quick look at 3 of the most popular recent movies.
And I'm humbled by your munificent offer, but my father would never allow it.
In Wicked, Madame Morrible invites Elphaba to attend classes at She's University. That's the call to adventure. In this case, the refusal of the call takes a fairly minor form, where Elphaba simply voices concern about her father, before ultimately accepting the call. In Nosferatu, Thomas' bosses literally calls him for an adventure, and Thomas is happy to accept. But the refusal of the call comes through Thomas's wife, Ellen,
You cannot leave.
who begs him not to go. Even slice-of-life movies have their own forms of refusal of the call to adventure. In A Real Pain, Benji invites David to be more extroverted,
We should pose with the guys. It'll be hysterical.
which is a call David refuses.
Doesn't that seem like disrespectful?
Interestingly, this moment also works as a mirror, where David tries to get Benji to be less of a joker,
I don't really know if we should.
which is a call that Benji refuses in turn.
Can you just get a picture of me then?
And to be clear, these aren't examples of characters refusing a cup of coffee. They're actively rejecting the entire arc of their movie, and all these moments invariably happen in the first act. One of the messages I hope to get across with this YouTube video is that, while good stories often exhibit this pattern of the refusal of the call, it doesn't mean the hero's journey is some recipe you have to follow. Following those rules for the sake of following them won't make the writing good, just like breaking the rules doesn't automatically make it bad.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
In fact, a hallmark of bad writing is blindly following the rules without questioning them, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Good writing, on the other hand, will do whatever makes sense, and more often than not, what makes sense is a refusal. Think about it. Imagine you're a 13-year-old in a village, and some strange old man shows up asking you to follow him on a quest to defeat the ultimate evil. You would probably have second thoughts, it's normal. So when a writer includes a refusal of the call in their story, they're not doing it to check a box on the hero's journey. They're doing it because it makes sense for the story. To establish a baseline, let's look at some typical examples of refusals of the call. Star Wars famously follows the hero's journey, but it does it well. Luke dreams of adventure,
If these new droids do work out, I want to transmit my application to the Academy this year.
but he initially refuses the call because his family needs him.
Harvest is when I need you the most.
This works because it's believable and establishes Luke as someone with a good heart, willing to sacrifice his dreams to help his loved ones. He only accepts the call after the Empire kills his family, leaving him with no reason to stay. That said, the change that moves a character from refusal to acceptance doesn't always have to be something as dramatic as the death of a family. Sometimes it's more internal.
I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure.
What? No. We do not want any adventure.
In the case of Bilbo, his journey from refusal to acceptance is driven by smaller things, like Gandalf's motivational speech,
I remember a young hobbit who was always running off in search of elves.
a song that stirs a longing for meaning, and the experience of the loneliness that comes with refusing the call. These quieter moments can lead a character to accept their adventure, even if nothing external has technically changed.
I'm going on an adventure!
From this, we can shape a basic template for refusals of the call to adventure and their eventual acceptance. First, the refusal has to be based on something real, either external circumstances, like Luke's family needing him, or internal ones, like Bilbo clinging to his comfortable life. Second, the reason for the refusal must evolve or even disappear before the third point, which is when the character finally accepts the call to adventure. Now, we could spend 5 hours analyzing typical examples of refusals, but let's leave it there and move on to a funnier category. Now, the thing about bad examples of refusals of the call is that they don't tend to be very memorable. Often they're only subliminally bad. And so I admit I had no example on hand, but I didn't worry, because bad refusals can be found anywhere there is poor writing. So I popped on the worst thing that happened to Prestige TV in recent memory, and the best thing that happened to people like me who like to analyze writing, and I watched Rings of Power, until a bad refusal of the call occurred. Thankfully I didn't have to watch long, because in the very first story thread, the writers go out of their way to show that Galadriel doesn't need her team. They're slowing her down, she's quite literally willing to leave them behind to die.
Wait, no! We keep moving!
They're a hindrance in the fight, they don't know how to find their way.
This way.
How can you be certain?
Etc. Then adventure calls in the form of Sauron's mark, or whatever this is supposed to be. It's the sign she's been looking for, and proves to Galadriel that she's getting closer to her goal. But her men refuse the call to adventure. They give up.
We march at first light.
Then you shall do so alone.
So what will Galadriel do? Will she refuse the call as well? It doesn't seem like she will, because the only two things we know about her are that she's desperate to follow Sauron's mark, and that she doesn't need her team. Thus, it looks like she has no reason to refuse the call. And we cut away from the scene. The first time I watched, I spent the next 15 minutes of the episode thinking she'd continued alone after Sauron. But the next time we see her, she's home. It looks like a refusal of the call to adventure happened off-screen. Probably because she had no reason to refuse it, and the writers knew it, so they just swept that part under the rug. I get that we're supposed to understand that she gave up because she couldn't continue without her team, but then the writers shouldn't have centered her whole character around the fact she didn't need them. So that's one bad refusal of the call. But funnily enough, in the same episode, Galadriel is asked to take a boat to a faraway land, which is a call she refuses.
And in the West, you think my fate would be better?
And the refusal seems very intense.
Where song would mock the cries of battle in my ears.
We cut away from the scene, and the next time we see her, she's on the boat. That's a second weird decision that happens off-screen. Though this time we didn't miss the refusal part, but the acceptance. Note that this kind of off-screen acceptance of the call can actually work sometimes, but especially in comedies.
You guys have to create a diversion.
What do you want me to do? Dress and drag and do the hula? Wow! If you're hungry for a hunk of fat and juicy...
Just to conclude on Galadriel, before the ship reaches its destination, she jumps off into the ocean, thus changing her mind again, with no properly developed evolution of her circumstances, as if she's doing some sort of bad writing speedrun. And her decision to jump leaves her alone in the middle of the ocean, which is absurd, and only an awful writing contrivance can save her from this predicament. Now, what I find interesting here is that, technically, this should work. The call to adventure is there, the refusal, the eventual acceptance. So if you feed the script to ChatGPT, it won't see any problem. And yet it fails to be a compelling refusal and acceptance because the rules of the hero's journey are being followed for the sake of following the rules, and in the process sacrifices all the actually important things, like character consistency, and even basic common sense. If the character is in a situation where they have no reason to refuse the call, then the writing answer is very simple. The character has to accept it.
Anyway, the job is yours if you want it.
Okay, I'm in.
It's perfectly fine. The refusal is not a box to tick, only something that usually happens because it's what makes sense in context. But if the context doesn't require it, then by all means, don't let the character refuse. Because to make a bad situation even worse, once the writer starts sacrificing the story to hit plot points, the Pandora's box of contrivances is opened. It's visible with Galadriel, who now needs a tiny boat to find her in the ocean, but it's even worse with the character of Isildur, still in season 1 of Rings of Power. Isildur's entire motivation is that a voice calls his name. And so he wants to go to Middle-earth. Then adventure calls for him in the form of the sea trials.
9 days until the sea trial. You ready?
Which is his chance at a life of travel. Presumably he should be happy about the trials, because his entire thing is that he wants to sail to Middle-earth. But the writers, again, think they have to follow the recipe, right? I mean, it's written right here, step 2, refusal. And so they think they have to come up with a reason for Isildur to refuse the call. And so now, Isildur does not want to do the sea trials.
That's all right.
I was thinking I might defer.
Because on a second watch, I'm actually still not clear why he refuses. But anyway, that's what he does. First asking to defer the trials, then failing on purpose.
It's my fault!
I let it slip.
So now that the refusal part is done, circumstances have to change for him to finally accept the call. But the writers have a problem, because the refusal made no sense in the first place, so it's hard to find a compelling evolution of these circumstances. They've written themselves into a dead end, and to get out of it, they can only come up with things that equally make no sense. The solution they go for is that Isildur's friend gets promoted to lieutenant, and so Isildur tries to get him to take him to Middle-earth.
Now please bring me with you.
I mean, fair enough, but he's essentially asking his friend to take him sailing, so Isildur looks a bit silly for refusing the sea trials in the first place.
Qualifications.
You belong to the Sea Guard?
You know I'm twice the same.
Do you belong to the Sea Guard?
And his friend only becomes lieutenant due to some horrible contrivances, with Elendil promoting him after a silly challenge.
Come at me. We will see who can score flesh.
Anyone that does, I will promote.
Which makes both Númenor's army and Galadriel look like a bunch of rival teenagers. Does it make sense that Elendil would distribute promotions to one of these 5 random soldiers? No.
Well done, Lieutenant.
This guy managed to touch Galadriel, but has he been established as being a good swordsman? No. Will the fact that he's a good swordsman come up again? No. Will the fact that he's now a lieutenant come up again in a meaningful way? No. And to somehow make it even worse, his promotion is thoroughly undeserved, with Galadriel playing with him as if he were a child. So yeah, anyway, that's what I mean when I say the writers can end up sacrificing their story in a misguided attempt at hitting plot points. In the end, bad refusals tend to exhibit at least one of these symptoms. They're jarring, because the audience doesn't understand why the call is refused. The call is eventually accepted, but without significant change in the situation. Or you can even go God mode, and do that trick of having either the refusal or the acceptance happen off-screen, and never talk about it again, hoping the audience won't notice. Now, this might all sound bleak, but not all calls to adventure have to be typical or bad. Some can be genuinely great. So earlier I put up a still of the blue pill red pill from The Matrix, and yet at first glance, it doesn't seem like there's a refusal of the call to adventure in this movie. In fact, it possibly features the most famous acceptance of the call in the recent history of cinema, with Neo willingly taking the red pill and thus embracing the adventure rather than resisting it. And yet Neo does initially refuse the adventure. Not here, but earlier.
There are 2 ways out of this building. One is that scaffold, the other is in their custody.
He could have followed Morpheus' instructions and escaped through the window, but it was too scary. And as a result, the agents arrested him. It doesn't feel like a refusal of the call because we empathize with Neo's unwillingness to risk his life. And yet it very clearly is. He chooses arrest over adventure. I consider it a great iteration of refusal of the call because it is seamlessly integrated into the story and allows for world building and character development. Without Neo's refusal and his arrest, we wouldn't have had this scene, which introduces the antagonists and also some supernatural elements, priming us for what comes next. The smoother transition from the ordinary world to the adventure also helps develop Neo's character, by showing how confusing it all is for him.
Jesus Christ, that thing's real!
Which, by the way, leads to this amazing line.
You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth.
Neo's refusal is great, because it is entirely believable, allows for a smoother transition into the story world, and doesn't feel like a detour. Because that tends to be the problem with the refusals. By definition, they are at risk of stopping the story. But here the refusal is so well integrated to the narrative that it doesn't feel like the refusal slows the story. Instead, it opens an interesting door. Similarly, can you remember if there was a refusal of the call in Harry Potter? It may not seem like it at first, because we remember Harry as being basically happy to learn he's a wizard.
Unless you'd rather stay, of course.
And yet, like in The Matrix, there is an incredibly obvious refusal of the call. Except it's not the protagonist who refuses, but the people around him.
Look, Harry's got a letter!
While not as subtle as in The Matrix, I still consider this refusal of the call very solid. First of all, because it's creative, and allows for these memorable scenes. But also because, like in The Matrix, it allows for a smoother transition into the meat of the story, with the early introduction of these light magical elements. It also gives us time to stay with the Dursleys, and experience how terrible Harry's life must have been. Things we knew theoretically, like him living under the stairs, etc. But it's only with the Dursleys' refusal of the call that we, the audience, get to experience just how awful they are to Harry. Interestingly, a pattern emerges from analyzing these refusals. They tend to fall into 2 categories. In the first, the character would like to go on the adventure but cannot, like Luke, Neo or Harry. In the other, the character can go on the adventure but doesn't want to, like Bilbo. Or I guess the typical example would be that of the experienced warrior who refuses to go on one last mission.
You're turning your back on them. What good's the reward if you ain't around to use it?
As for Isildur and Galadriel, well, they don't fit the pattern because they both can go on the adventure and they also want to go, which basically is another way to say that they had no reason to refuse the call. In the end, good refusals tend to be justified, and we, the audience, either empathize with the refusal or at least feel compassion for the character who cannot accept the call due to external forces. They also deepen the story world and or develop character, and they are discreet, in the sense that they come naturally and seamlessly, and the audience doesn't necessarily realize that the calls are being refused. We are just watching a good story with things that make sense. Finally, let's talk about one of the greatest of all time.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius.
When Marcus Aurelius wants him to become the next Caesar, Maximus graces us with an excellent refusal of the call.
With all my heart, no.
It's already compelling for several reasons. Maximus has been fighting his whole life and finally wants to enjoy retirement with his family.
My house is in the hills above Tehillo. Very simple place.
His refusal does not frustrate the audience. We understand where he's coming from because we've seen the dirt of the fight, and if there was a time when he was excited about war, then that time is long gone. And now it's only a sober sense of duty that guides Maximus to keep killing the enemies of Rome. So we understand why he longs for the end of his story. From a storytelling point, his arc of being a general has already been completed. And not only is there no glory left for him to chase, but he's also disillusioned about the glory he's earned.
2,000 will never leave this place. I will not believe that they fought and died for nothing.
And would happily return to anonymity.
Very simple place.
When he refuses Marcus Aurelius' call, he is not doing it out of a sense that he needs to follow the hero's journey and that this is step 2 and so he needs to refuse. Instead, he genuinely does not want to become Caesar. And it's believable because, as a high-ranking general...
How can I reward Rome's greatest general?
Let me go home.
He has no illusions about the burden that being Caesar entails. His refusal is not one of youthful hesitation. Instead, it's respectful, but confident. And to make it even better, like Marcus Aurelius says, this call is a great honor, and it feels like anyone should accept it. Now, in a lesser movie, it would be frustrating to see a character refuse something that any reasonable person would accept.
I was thinking I might defer.
But the interesting thing in the case of Maximus is that his refusal is exactly the reason why Marcus Aurelius chose him.
That is why. It must be you.
The call is a gift that anyone would accept, and thus it has to be offered to the only character who won't accept it. So that's all neat, and firmly puts Maximus in the can but won't category. But what I think transcends Maximus's refusal to actual uniqueness is what the movie ends up doing with it. Because, as we know, what typically happens is that the refusal is followed by a change in circumstances, leading the character to accept the call. And here, something like that does happen, with Commodus killing his father in the night. Now, obviously, learning of the death of the emperor the next morning,
Our great father is dead.
Maximus immediately understands that Commodus killed him. And that is the change in circumstance that, arguably, pushes Maximus to change his mind and accept the call. By refusing to recognize Commodus as the emperor,
Take my hand.
he does what Marcus Aurelius would have wanted of him. However, while in the previous evening Maximus was in the can but won't category, now instead of going to the acceptance like the others, he actually moves over to the want but can't category, because the call was for him to become the next Caesar, and it's too late for that, because no one but himself and Commodus knows the truth about Marcus Aurelius' choice. And so Maximus does not continue on the hero's journey that would have led him to become emperor, and instead he ends up in a different story.
Promise me that you will look after my family.
Your family will meet you in the afterlife.
In the other movies that we looked at, the refusal of the call is like an obstacle that is eventually passed by the protagonist. But it's not the case with Maximus. His refusal sticks. And so this was not a detour in the story, but instead propelled Maximus into something different, as if he's ejected from the planned hero's journey, where he was supposed to become emperor, and ends up in a different one where he becomes a gladiator. This is quite neat from a theoretical storytelling analysis, but in terms of the actual experience of the movie, it also serves the greatness of Maximus as a character, because all the bad things that happened to him happened because Marcus Aurelius wanted him to become Caesar, and thus Commodus has to get rid of him. However, this is doubly unfair, because Maximus did not even want to become Caesar, so he's being punished for a gift that he never even accepted. So Maximus's refusal of the call keeps haunting him throughout the story. If he had been more decisive at the time of the call and became emperor, then his family would still be alive. Obviously, Crow's charisma and Maximus's stoic attitude play a big part into why the character is such an icon today. But in essence, what I think makes Maximus so great is that he embodies the refusal of the call. He's doing the things that he does out of a sense of duty, both to his family and to Rome, but the entire time he does not want to be there. He didn't want to become a gladiator, and didn't want to become the next Caesar. He'd much rather be retired at home. The refusal of the call is an integral part of Maximus's character, much more than for Luke, Harry or Neo, because at the end of their journeys, they will not spend a second thinking about the refusal of their calls, when the Dursleys took their letters, or how going out the window was scary. They have no regrets and no what-ifs, but Maximus must be haunted by the regrets and the what-ifs. Had he accepted the call, then his family would still be alive. This ties to something interesting, which is that if you remove the refusals, say the Dursleys are actually nice and just let Harry go to Hogwarts with the first letter, or Uncle Owen supports Luke in his plans of adventure, or Bilbo just agrees to the adventure on his doorstep, well, in each of those, the overall story would basically remain unchanged. Sure, it would be a bit lesser, because you'd miss some important character development, but overall, they would still end up defeating Voldemort, destroying the Death Star, or getting to the Dragon's Lair. So the movie would remain essentially the same, with just a shorter runtime, which kind of implies that all those refusals are small detours, albeit interesting ones. The same cannot be said of Maximus. If he had accepted the call, then the movie would have been about him going to Rome as Caesar, because, presumably, the Emperor wouldn't have waited to make it official. He did seem in a hurry.
By sunset, I hope you will have agreed.
So if Maximus had agreed that evening, then Commodus would have had no time to kill his father. In other words, had he not refused the call to adventure, the story would be nothing like it ended up being. And it's quite a tour de force that, after killing the man responsible for the death of his family, the actual catharsis of the movie does not come from the fulfilled revenge. We don't revel in Commodus's death as much as we admire Maximus for the way he transcends his revenge, and is able to look beyond to the greater good.
Free my men. Senator Gracchus is to be reinstated. There was a dream that was wrong. It shall be realized.
That's all made possible by Marcus Aurelius' call, which had remained unanswered until now, and that Maximus can finally accept in the last moment of his life.
These are the wishes of Marcus Aurelius.
Because Commodus's death allows him to move out of the want but can't category and accept the call. So Maximus essentially becomes Caesar for a few seconds, just enough to give his orders and fulfill Marcus Aurelius' wish. As if there were in fact two juxtaposed movies here. In one, the story of a gladiator who has completed his hero's journey by reaching the highest of highs in the arena. In the other, the story where Maximus becomes emperor, but he just finally got past the refusal part and is only able now to accept the call. Typically this is an Act 1 moment, but in Gladiator, this happens at the end. And the real genius is that it doesn't take away from the revenge story, instead it elevates it. Yes, we had the satisfying revenge of the Gladiator, but the juxtaposed emperor storyline gives it all a higher, nobler purpose, and it's an amazing ending. Please don't make me talk about how Gladiator 2 erases all of that. It's too sad, I don't want to talk about it. Okay, maybe I do want to talk about it, but that's for another video. And so, how does one go about writing such an original variation of the hero's journey? Well, the best way to do that is to ignore the hero's journey completely. Just write whatever makes sense for the story, without caring about staying in the tracks. Because the thing about the hero's journey is that it works better as an analysis tool after the fact, but it isn't meant to be used as a recipe. If you ever write any story, chances are that a hero's journey can always be reverse engineered from it. For example, here we have ChatGPT dutifully explaining to us why Tinky Winky from the Teletubbies follows a hero's journey. Some will say that the ability to reframe Tinky Winky's story as an example of a hero's journey only speaks to the universality of its concepts. And others will say that it only speaks to the vagueness of the hero's journey. And you can always say that I'm completely wrong, and that Maximus is actually a perfect example of the hero's journey. And you'd basically be right, because there are indeed 3 acts, points of no return, and all that good stuff. So I have no doubt that you can make the movie fit in that framework. However, the point I try to get across in this video is that, as writers, we shouldn't care much about following these patterns. Instead, we should focus on telling a good story. And if, even when it's not the intent, we end up accidentally writing a hero's journey, then at least it will be a unique variation. When I started this channel, I thought I would keep my videos under 10 minutes to be respectful of your time, and of mine, incidentally. But obviously this one completely blew past the target runtime. I can only work on these videos after work, late in the evenings or on the weekends, so I apologize for my past and future erratic upload schedule. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this one. Please consider liking and subscribing if you did, to help pull this video out of the algorithm's purgatory. I also wanted to thank you again for the amazing advice and support you left on my previous videos. Honestly, it's really what has kept me going. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.